Hello everyone and welcome to the Tank Club. Today I've got a new build to show you, and this is a build that answers the question I've been asked quite a few times over the years. What is the most selfish tank build that you would be willing to play? This is it right here, and I'm going to show you all about it. This is the easy tank build. So this build is for people who are looking to take that next step. So if you are maybe somebody who's created a tank, you've been progressing, you've been figuring out how to play as a tank, now you want to start working on slightly more difficult content, but you're a progressive tank, and you're going to also be in those kind of groups with beginner players and progressive players where there's a lot of mistakes, there's a lot of deaths, there's a lot of issues. So this build is to help you get through that content, and we're going to kind of also explain what you would progress onto afterwards as well. So first of all, we've got the class, and obviously Dragon Knights are going to work extremely well for this build, mostly because using your ultimate gives you back resources, using some of your core skills like Igneous Shield and Cinderstorm, things like that, they give you stamina back, which means this is going to be very, very easy to sustain. Now you can play this on other classes if you want to, but the Dragon Knight is going to be the best option. For the race, I have chosen Nord. This is to generate my ultimate faster. This is to give me more health and stamina, and it's for the increased resistances. I don't want to have to find resistances from other areas to bring this build up to the point where it can survive all situations and encounters. So I've gone with the Nord to buff up my resistances. For our consumables, we are using the Red Frothgar food. This is to give us a nice big chunk of max health, so we've got nearly 5k max health, and a huge amount of magic recovery. So 451 increased magic recovery by using this food. With the Munda Stone, we have got the Atronach, and this is increasing our magic recovery by 507. That is because of some of our gear traits and stuff, which we'll look at in a few moments. And when it comes to our potions, you want to be using Tri-Stat potions. This is so we can regain all of our resources back, but most importantly, it's so we get the major fortitude, the major intellect, the major endurance, which is going to increase our recoveries by another 30%. And this is on 100% cooldown. So if you use your potion on cooldown, you'll get 100% uptime on those major buffs. If you don't use it, obviously you can have much lower recoveries, but obviously then you can use the potions for those stat gains at important moments instead. For the attributes on this build, I've gone with 50 into health and 14 into stamina. That gives me 17k magicka, almost 40k health, and then 20k stamina. If we fully buff up and then take a look at our stat sheet, so we'll use our armor buff and our potion. As you can see, we've got 2,310 magic recovery, we've got 33,163 spell, and 32,437 physical resistance. If we take a look at our advanced stats, 887 block cost, which is slightly higher than if we were using like a full sturdy setup, but still not that high. It's about 150 more than it would be if we were using a full sturdy. So we're at 82% block mitigation, so if we block an attack, we're only going to be taking 18% of the damage that enemy does, and that's without even including our resistances or our other buffs and things that we're going to add on top of that as well. So you're going to be taking very, very small amounts of damage. Okay, so for the gear, we are using the Engine Guardian monster set. We're using a light piece and a medium piece so that we can achieve the 511 setup. We use Engine Guardian because this is meant to be a tank build that's easy. It's easy to get into content, it's easy to do content. Later on, you would progress the Engine Guardian monster set onto something else. So we use it purely for the self-sustain. This should help you to not need to use anything else that's selfish or just for you. Everything else you're going to use is going to be something that's going to improve group DPS or group performance. This is the only thing you use for you to help you. But what you'll do is you'll progress away from this later. So you use Engine Guardian now. When you want to advance this and maybe you manage and you sustain better, you'll move on to Nazare, you'll move on to something like Archdruid, the Spulder of Ruin, Tremor Scale, and things like that. But this is meant to be a build for people starting that progression ladder. Getting onto that ladder, use this monster set to start with, move away from it later on when you understand and know mechanics. So Engine Guardian is the best monster set in the game for sustain. When you're just casting your abilities as normal, you've got a chance to proc it. And it's going to give you resources back. It's going to give you huge amounts of resources. It doesn't matter which resource you get with a Dragon Knight, you can make a benefit from having them coming into your character. If you're getting Magicka back, you spam Igneous Shield, you cast your Magicka skills, you refresh your Magicka buffs and debuffs. If you're getting stamina back, then great. You're able to continue to use your block and your roll dodge and your taunt and your stamina skills. If you're getting health back, you use balance. So go onto your back bar, use balance. The health is coming in, and it's healing you straight away for the amount of health that you used with balance. With the balance skill, it's going to give you 3k Magicka back, and then you convert your Magicka back to stamina again by using Igneous Shield. You use Igneous Shield because it gives you a shield, it gives you extra healing, it gives you loads of different buffs. So you're kind of topping up whichever resource you need the most at that moment. Obviously, if you're low on health and you've got the healing proc, then leave it. If you're low on Magicka, leave it. But you don't want to ever be full on a resource. You don't ever want to be full on Magicka and then get the Magicka proc from Engine Guardian. It's a waste. You don't ever want to be sitting there on full health with the health proc of Engine Guardian. It's a waste. So always make sure you're doing something to make sure you put in the resources into the area that you need them. So on our body pieces, on our chest, hands, legs, feet and waist, we're using Pearlescent Ward. Now what this is going to do is provide some great survivability for yourself and your group. So as I mentioned at the start, this is aimed at people jumping on that progression ladder, where you're in groups where people don't know what they're doing, where there's a lot of deaths, there's a lot of problems. This is going to help you and your group survive those sort of encounters, maybe recover them, maybe advance that little bit further than you might have done. This will proc and give damage reduction based on the amount of people that are dead, but it's also a damage buff. So usually a tank might use the Yolnahkrin set, and this is very, very similar. It's not too much different. So you haven't got Minor Courage on your build. You're not providing Minor Courage. You're providing Pearlescent Ward instead. But it's going to have that double benefit where it's giving a damage buff when people are alive. When people die, it's going to provide damage reduction. And even if you're the one who's dead, it's still going to provide the damage reduction to your group. So very, very strong, very, very useful for this exact situation. Obviously, if you've got somebody else in your group using this set, then it's not worth using two of them because it doesn't stack. It's only worth having one. So in that case, you would switch away to a different gear set. But obviously, once you are progressing and you are doing better, if you're the main tank, you might switch this to Turning Tide, you might switch it to Crimson Oath, you might switch it to Yolnahkrin or something like that. So this is mainly just now for this situation where you're in this progression. For off tanks, they might continue to use this in the groups they're in, combined with things like Powerful Assault and whatnot, but that's something to worry about later down the line. So Pearlescent Ward, really, really good set. It's going to give you max health, it's going to give you Minor Aegis, it's going to give you increased heal and take and those kinds of things. So it's adding those buffs on as well, and you get the nice group buff and damage reduction as well. The next set we're using is Saxhleel Champion. Again, another safety set. The reason we are using this particular gear set is so you can use Barrier as your ultimate. The benefit to doing this is when you cast Barrier, you're still going to provide the same buff as Warhorn. So your group are going to get Major Force, but you're going to also give them a 30k damage shield. You get that for yourself and you get that for your group. This can be stacked, so somebody else can also use Sax Champion. As long as you're not casting your ultimates at the same time, then you're not going to have this overlap problem. But this really, really good set for safety. So while I'm saying this is the most selfish build that I've ever created, it's also not, because the two gear sets that we are using are providing damage buffs. Sax Champion is going to give you max Magicka and max stamina, which is nice to push those stats up a little bit further. You are double stacking Minor Aegis. That's the only downside to using these two sets together. But that is not a problem because the overall benefit is the 5-piece. That's the thing that we're mainly using the sets for. That's the thing we're focusing on the most, and that's the most important part. When you use an ultimate ability while in combat, you and up to 11 group members within 28 meters gain Major Force for 1 second per 15 ultimate spent. So the more ultimate that you've managed to build up as well, the more you're actually going to give in terms of the duration of that Major Force. So in those moments where mechanics are happening, where people are dying, you've not only got the damage reduction from your Pearlescent Ward, but you've also potentially got a huge damage shield for everybody with this particular skill as well. So you've just got such great safety But it's not just safety for you. This is the thing. A lot of selfish tank builds will be selfish for just the tank. This is providing those safety, those selfish benefits for your entire group. It's not just for you, it's for everybody, but it's also giving the damage buff as well. And that's the integral part, that's the important part of this entire build. With Sax Champion, you can double bar this if you want. I'm using it on the jewelry and I'm using it on the eye staff. You could use it on the one hand and the shield if you wanted to have it double barred, so that you can double bar your barrier and use it on either bar. I like to just have it one barred on the back bar, and then on the front bar that means you can also use a weapon set. The only really useful weapon set in this situation is the Master's one hand and shield, the Puncture and Remedy set that you get from Dragonstar Arena. And this is, again, it's another great set. So when you cast your taunt, you're going to heal, you're going to gain resistances. You don't really need the resistances. Let's say you made your resolvers ran out and you don't want to jump onto your back bar because there's a mechanic about to happen. You hit your taunt, you've pretty much covered the loss of having that for a few seconds, and then you switch your bar, you cast your major resolve. Obviously, it's not realistic to expect someone to spam taunt to keep getting the resistances. It's not worth spamming it, but it's an additional heal. So if you've ran out of magicka and you're in a desperate situation, you can cast your taunt. Taunt is always a cheap skill. Your pierce armor is a cheap skill. You can keep casting that for a short period of time to regain some health back if that is causing you an issue. So we've got a number of different gear sets here that are going to provide a range of different benefits. Now, if you were using the perfected gear sets, you would have those additional benefits. I'm currently not wearing them because I wanted to show you what it would be like without the perfected gear sets. I would have more stats if I was using perfected. I'd have more stamina, I'd have more health, I'd be able to adjust my resources potentially to spread them out a bit further. So I'd probably stick around 40k health, and then I'd put some more into stamina if I was stacking higher health because I was using perfected gear. But the idea of this was to show you that you don't need to use the perfected gear. Obviously you want to achieve that later, but if you're trying to get your foot on the ladder, you're trying to get into the content at the starting point, then this is kind of what it'd look like. So for the gear, I am using one piece of reinforced on the chest. That is to get my resistances to the cap, and I'm using everything else in divines. Now, as I already showed you, my block cost is around 850. If I was to use full sturdy, it'd go down to about 750. It really, like, the more you're blocking, obviously the more useful sturdy would be. So you wouldn't use a bracing enchant on your jewelry, but you would use potentially a full sturdy setup, because you can't, like, whichever way you play this, whether you go with full sturdy or full divines, and then you just adjust your jewelry depending on which one you've gone with, you're going to achieve around about the same values in everything that we're going to show you here. On the body pieces as well, you want to go with the prismatic enchants. Obviously the reason for that is because you get 2,000 more overall stats by doing so. If I used just a single stat enchant instead, so let's say I just used all stamina enchants, I'd have 2,000 less overall stats than what I've got right now, which is not something that I want. Obviously they are very expensive, so what you would do is you'd maybe put all your points into health, use big pieces stamina, small pieces magicka to kind of get some more stats and things that way, if you couldn't afford to buy the tri-stat glyphs. Obviously my armor's all heavy armor because I'm using a 5-1-1. My monster set was 1 light, 1 medium, so all my body pieces are heavy armor, and Pearlescent Ward only drops in heavy anyway. In terms of the weapons, the Ice Staff needs to be infused, needs to be Crusher, and you need to maintain that as much as you can by just keeping your blockade on the ground. On the front bar, you've got a bit more, you've got a few more options. So I'm using a defending one-hander, that's to take my resistances up, and that means that I'm at the resistance cap. You could use infused, you could use charged. If you're a Dragon Knight, charged one-hander with a poison enchant would give you 1,000 stamina back around about once every 5 seconds. You could use charged shock if you wanted to provide some minor vulnerability, which is going to increase group damage by 5%. You could use a range of other things. You could use absorb stamina, you could use prismatic enchant if you wanted to get all 3 stats back. It's up to you with the one-hander, but I've personally gone with the defending here. And then finally your jewelry. So depending on what skills you use and different things like that, you can kind of customize your jewelry a little bit. You want to go 3 infused no matter what. The more you're blocking, the more block cost reduction you need. So a bracing enchant on an infused piece of jewelry, that's what I've got here to get my block cost down to 850 or around about that area. Because I know a lot of people that are going to be at this stage of the game where they're going into content for the first time. The people that this build is aimed at are going to be blocking more often than not. So you're going to have to reduce that block cost. Once you start advancing further on and you don't need to block as much, you take that block cost reduction away and you add in more magicka cost reduction instead. So I am using 3 infused, 1 block cost reduction, 1 bracing enchant, and then 2 magicka cost reduction glyphs as well. The reason why I'm doing this is because my food is giving me so much magicka recovery, and because I'm using full divines and I'm also using the Atronach Munderstone, I'm sitting on that magicka recovery of over 2,000, and I'm able to reduce my abilities quite a lot. Now, if I was trying to maintain the stagger skill, I would maybe potentially use the prismatic cost reduction, so I can reduce the stamina cost of abilities as well. But in this case, I've only got 1 stamina skill, and that's pierce armor, so it's not worth it. The more stamina skills you use, the more useful the tri-cost reduction is going to be. Just remember that if you change anything within this build, like let's say you go with sturdy gear, then cost reduction is going to be more difficult. You're going to need to use magicka recovery instead. So it really, if you change anything, then you're going to have to look at the long-term impact that it's going to have on the build. You've got to have recovery and cost reduction. You can't have one or the other. You can't have reduction and no recovery, because it doesn't work. You'll run out of resources. You've got to have, you want to be hitting around that 2k magicka recovery to make the use of the cost reduction. The cost reduction is important on a Dragon Knight because your skills are quite expensive. Igneous Shield's 4k, your healing skill is 4k. They're all really expensive magicka skills, but with 2 cost reduction in there, it brings them down to a more sustainable level. But importantly as well, it also makes your Cinderstorm skill free. So that's kind of a nice little perk to go alongside that. But yeah, all of your magicka skills are really expensive, your chains are expensive, everything's expensive. So having that cost reduction and the recovery combined together is really, really useful. If we take a look at the skill bars, we've got Pierce Armor as our first skill. This is your taunt and your debuff that's going to provide that major amount of breach. The next skill is Engulfing Flames. This is a group buff. If you're the only Dragon Knight in a group, it's nice to provide this because you're going to give your group more damage by flame attacks. If you've got a group that aren't doing any kind of flame damage, or you've got another Dragon Knight, then you don't need to use this. You can use something else instead, and we'll go over optional skills in a moment. The next skill is Igneous Shield. Great skill for converting magicka into stamina. Great skill for giving you major mending, for giving you things like an additional shield. So it's giving you like a 9k damage shield. But it's also giving your group members a 3 to 4k damage shield as well. So it's something you can cast a lot, especially in these situations in progression and beginner content when you haven't got as many uptimes to worry about. Like, we're looking at skills here that are really long duration. Like your Engulfing Flames is a good duration. Taunt, your Pierce Armor is a good duration, so then you've got time to cast stuff in between. Never allow that magicka bar to sit there on full. If it's full, cast an Igneous Shield, give your group some protection, give yourself some protection, give yourself some stamina back. The next skill is our Burst Heal, and that is Coagulating Blood. Really nice heal. You want to use it when you are as low health as possible because you can't sustain spamming this to keep yourself alive. You want to just use it when you're low on health. But if you do use it at 80% health, it's going to give you a heal. So the other morph wouldn't give you as good of a heal as this one does. This outperforms the Green Dragon Blood morph by quite a lot nowadays, so this is the better one to go with. On the front bar, our last main skill is Unrelenting Grip. This is to pull enemies in, and that is literally it. So when you need to chain stuff in, you use that skill. Now, if you need to switch this out for something else, maybe you can put this even on your back bar so you can utilize more skills on your front bar. If you're using Stagger, for example, you might slot that here. Your Stone Giant would go there, and this would go onto the back bar. For the front bar ultimate, I'm using Replenishing Barrier. Now, I'm using it double barred for the magicka recovery, but you could switch this and just have it on the back bar and then use a different ult on the front bar to help with other stuff. But I like to have it double barred and then just use it only on the back bar to make use of my Sax Champion gear set. You don't want to use this ult on the front bar, but if you are going to accidentally use it, slot something else instead. The Sword and Board ulti can be a really good one. So if you are kind of going into some content where you should never get the resurrections if people die as a tank, well, the main tank, but you could use the Sword and Board ulti so you can res people. So you'll auto block with the Sword and Board ulti. You'll be able to get a res because you'll be blocking, but you won't be blocking if you had the Sword and Board ulti. So consider that if you have a lot of deaths in your groups. If you're in those progressive groups, people are dead, this might be a good option. When we switch to the back bar, we have got Frost Clench. Unbelievable skill, especially on boss fights. This is fantastic because it applies a taunt first of all, but then it also gives the chilled effect to the enemy. And that means you get minor maim, you also get major maim by using this skill, and you also provide your group with minor brittle. So it increases the damage that your enemies take, and it also decreases the enemy's damage that they do. So a great skill to use, and you want to be casting this as often as possible. So we have quite a lot of long duration skills on this particular build, but you want to be casting Frost Clench every 5 or 6 seconds or something like that. You want to try and maintain those debuffs on the enemy as much as you can, so that is your main spammable. If you do bring in Stone Giant and stagger into this build, it's going to be much more difficult because you then got 2 really short cooldowns. You've got the 4 seconds, every 4 seconds you've got to be casting a stagger and a Frost Clench, so you're going to have a lot more work to do, but that's where you want to try and achieve. You want to try and get to that point in the long term. Like, that's the goal for the future, is to be able to run all the cooldowns, but for now, just focus mainly on this one. The next skill is Igneous Weapons. This is to provide your group with increased damage. Now, there's 2 reasons for this. So one, if you are in a beginner group, you're in a progressive group, you're just starting out, there's a chance that potentially people won't be using potions or the correct potions, or they'll forget to use their potions, and this is a super long duration skill. So you could use this to cover that potential gap where people aren't using their potions, the damage dealers especially, and even the healers as well. The second reason is, if your group are kind of thinking about how they're going to function, this is a great skill to use to improve group DPS. So your group could use ultimate gain potions, so you use this to provide a buff to your group, so then they can use a different type of potion to get additional benefits, and then you cover them by giving them the major sorcery and major brutality. The next skill is Elemental Blockade, Frost Blockade. Again, we need this skill. You need to have this on the ground permanently. As a tank who's progressing content, the 2 main things you need to focus on obviously is your taunt and your block, staying alive, but then Blockade, Elemental Blockade. It's like the first additional debuff that you want to be able to provide to your group so that they can do more damage. And this is going to maintain your Crusher enchant on the enemy, which means that your group are going to do more damage to that enemy, which is exactly what we need. So if you're not going to do anything else other than taunt, make sure you've got Blockade on the ground, because it's super important. It's like the first real skill that you need to look at maintaining as a progressive and a new and advancing tank. Make sure you've got that down on the ground, and it's going to provide a lot of benefits. It also provides a projectile shield, which can be really useful in fights where you've got a lot of ranged enemies or things shooting projectiles into your group. You can even spam it when that's the case, so you can cast it a couple of times. When you look at trials like VHOF, for example, you've got a lot of projectiles in the execute phase. You can spam Blockade, that protects your group against the projectiles. So it has a lot of good uses, does Elemental Blockade, not just for keeping Crusher up, but for the utility it provides as well. The next skill is Balance. It's a sustain skill, so it gives you 3,000 magicka every time you use it, and it costs health. And as we mentioned before, when you use an Engine Guardian, this is a great skill because you can convert health into magicka. So if you're on full health and Engine Guardian is giving you health, you don't want to sit there with full health. You just cast Balance, you transfer it over to your magicka bar instead. So it's really useful, but also it's just good in general situations, especially when you've got a healer. If a healer's got their healing down over the top of you, when you're not taking heavy attacks, you can be casting it to get some resources back if you need them. So brilliant skill with a lot of utility, and by having it on your bar as well, you get a few different passives from your Mage's Guild, which give you some additional recoveries and things like that. The next skill is Cinderstorm. This is so you've got a bit of a heal over time. So you place it on yourself, you give yourself a heal over time that's free. The reason why is because you don't want to be spamming healing skills to try and keep yourself alive. You don't want to be spamming Coagulating Blood for like 3,500 magicka to stay alive. By putting a skill over the top, it's going to tick every second. It's going to heal you for like 1,500 to 2,000 health. If you cast an Igneous Shield while inside that as well, that's going to buff the healing, so it's going to do more healing. So it's a nice way to keep yourself alive or top off your healing and not rely, so you don't have to 100% rely on your healer. It's a bit of a protective skill, but later on in the game when you've got good healers and you've got good players and you're in better groups, this is a skill that you drop off and you slot something that's more useful. So this would be the skill that I would drop to use Stone Giant, and then I would switch it to the front bar and I'd put chains on the back bar here. So that is how I would kind of switch this around to make it a bit more group orientated rather than focusing on your self-survival. It does also provide a snare to enemies and stuff as well, so there is that in there, and that is how you would use that skill. If you spam this skill, because it's free and it costs nothing, when you cast it, it gives you 990 stamina back because of your Dragon Knight passives. So you get additional sustain just by casting it. So spam it. You're running out of stamina, maybe you're in a really difficult situation. You can cast it a couple of times, it'll give you almost 1,000 stamina back each time. So it has another function there. The fact it gives you sustain, but obviously when you're spamming it, it's not doing any healing. So just remember that if you don't need the healing, but you do need the stamina, you can spam it and it's going to be free. It's going to give you stamina back. Finally, we got barrier. Again, replenishing barrier. The reason why I use the replenishing barrier morph as well is because when people get the shield and then that shield gets used up, you gain ultimate back, which means you should be able to cast this more often and quicker. So that is why we use the replenishing barrier morph with this build. It's really important to cast your Earthen Heart skills regularly, so Helping Hands is going to give you the stamina back. Mountain's Blessings provide another group buff. It's increasing your group's weapon damage by 10%. A lot of groups nowadays, they stack weapon damage rather than spell damage, so it's really important to provide this minor brutality as well. So you've got quite a lot of group buffs on a Dragon Knight, which makes them really, really useful. You also get ultimate back once every 6 seconds by using this. So obviously when you cast Igneous Shield or you cast your Cinderstorm, you're going to provide the group buff, you're going to get some ultimate, you're going to get some stamina, and then obviously the last major passive is Battle Roar, and this is how you're going to sustain. So you want to be using potions on cooldown to help you sustain, and you want to be using your ultimate on cooldown for your sustain as well. So you're going to get a ton of sustain from Battle Roar, and you're also going to get all that extra protection because of the gear you're using as well. As I mentioned before, alternative skills that you could use, you got Stone Giant. This is an additional group buff, but it's hard to maintain. You can use it in more advanced situations. So trial situations where you know what you're doing, where you don't have to pay 100% attention to the boss because you know what's going to kind of come, what's going to happen. You know what to expect, you know how to anticipate what the boss is going to do. This is where you start to use Stone Giant, and this is a skill that you have to cast like every 4 actions. So time it, 1 skill, 2 skill, 3 skill, Stone Giant. It's got to be the 4th action every time so that you maintain the uptime of it. So that is a really good skill to use once you're kind of looking to advance this build a bit further. As I mentioned before, on the front bar you could slot Spell Wall. This would just be so that you can get those resurrections, you can help out if need to. It's going to be a very low cost ultimate as well, and it's going to give you resources back because you're a Dragon Knight. So I wouldn't advise it, but if you need something on the front bar for some other content, some certain pieces of content where there are people dying, potentially use this. If you wanted to use this build for dungeons, you would need some crowd control. So on your back bar, you'd probably drop Igneous Weapons for add pulls, and you would slot Pulsar instead. You would also want to consider switching out the Master's One Hand and Shield and using the Void Bash set instead. And then you would need to use the Power Slam skill just there to be able to proc that. On the front bar ultimate, if you didn't want to use the shield wall and you don't want a double bar barrier, another great option is Temporal Guard. This is going to give you minor protection, which is going to reduce your damage taken by 5%, which gives you even more like survivability. So slot this if you want something that's going to give you damage reduction and make things a little bit easier for you. This is also a really good ultimate for when you start blocking less often. So sometimes when you start to advance yourself, you block less. And when you block less, you need to reduce your damage as much as possible because you're not going to be blocking. So you're not going to have that 82% block mitigation. At that point, you need to start thinking about things like minor and major protection and resistances and all that kind of stuff. So adding this on then would become really, really useful. If you didn't want to use a defending one-hander or any reinforced pieces of gear, you don't need to do that because you can just replace those by using Resolving Vigor. Now, Resolving Vigor costs quite a lot of stamina, but it does give you a heal over time, and it gives you the minor resolve. So it gives you additional resistances for 20 seconds. So you'd use your balance and your Resolving Vigor each time to buff yourself up. Like I say, the only trouble is it's going to cost you stamina to do so, nearly 3k. If you are going to use this and you're going to use Stagger and you're going to use stamina skills, you're going to need to switch your jewelry over to Infused Tri-Cost Reduction to make sure this is low enough that you can sustain it, but this is an option if you need to. And the last real skill for me is if you didn't want to use Engulfing Flames, let's say somebody else in your group's using it, or your group's not using fire damage, or you go into like a dungeon or some really, really hard damage, Revealing Flare would be another fantastic option. This will give you 10% more Magicka recovery by having it slotted because of that Magicka Raid passive, but also it gives you major protection by having it slotted, so even more damage reduction. So really, really useful to have this slotted as well if you want to reduce that damage even further. Finally, we're on to the champion points. On your blue CP, I just slot Duelist Rebuff, Enduring Resolve, Bulwark, and Ironclad. Obviously, you want to take everything that reduces your damage at any kind of way. Those are the most important ones. If you are going into a fight like Sunspire, for example, with the dragons, where they do big AoE damage, then slot Unassailable. But in most cases, Unassailable is probably one of the least useful passives in your champion points, because there isn't really that much huge AoE damage in the game compared to other damage sources. So this is the least useful. And also you've got to think about the fact that if you've got loads of damage reduction already, if you take a 10k hit from an AoE source and you're only going to reduce it by 6%, that's almost nothing. And then when you add on top of that resistances, you add on top of that your damage mitigation that you've got, obviously AoE damage is very, very small. And all the other ones are much more useful. For your red CP, Boundless Vitality to give you more max health, always nice. Increased armor to get yourself up to that resistance cap, and rejuvenation to give yourself more guaranteed 100% increased recovery. Well, I've got Brace and Anchor slotted here, which is really, really good because it's going to give us 20% block mitigation, but it does reduce your movement speed. Because you're on a Dragon Knight and you're going to be casting Barrier, and you're going to be casting Igneous Shield and things like that quite a lot, especially if, like I say, you're at that early phase of progression. Wardmaster, another fantastic option. For the DK as well, if you are casting a lot of barriers, then you can use Shieldmaster because it reduces the cost of your damage shield abilities by 2%. That includes Barrier. So because you're looking to cast this more often, this is something you can slot to reduce the cost of your ultimate. It's going to reduce the cost of your Igneous Shield. It's going to be quite a useful skill. So if you do want to help yourself out with that reduced cost, it might be up to you. You might want to weigh up the options, weigh up the difference between Shieldmaster and maybe you don't need Bracing Anchor. Maybe Rejuvenation with only giving you that 90 recovery isn't necessarily as good potentially as Shieldmaster. I'll leave that one up to you to decide if you want to switch that out or not. Okay guys, that is everything for this build. This was my easy tank build. This is for players looking to start progressing trials, progressing harder content. You want to get in at that kind of entry level, and you're in a group where players are progressing as well, so there might be a lot of deaths, a lot of mistakes, a lot of problems. This build will help you get through that content, still providing group buffs and benefits. I've given you the options for what to switch to later on as well. If you need any more information, make sure you check out thetankclub.com and the Tank Club on Discord. Thank you very much for everyone who supports the Tank Club content on Patreon, on YouTube and everywhere else as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye for now.